Okay, we are back for another live Q&A with Mooch, and if you don't know, which you should already, he's a former F-14 RIO and now YouTube superstar. But Mooch, what's been happening on your ends over the last couple of months?
YouTube superstar. Well, thank you, Mike. It's great to be back on the channel. Well, I've been busy. As promised, we took the show on the road. Went to Tailhook in Reno in late August. Had a booth there, and my wife came out to be my assistant. Her first Tailhook convention, the last one they're doing at the Nugget, which is a casino complex with a lot of charm and character, but a little bit long in the tooth. So they're moving from the Nugget to the GSR, the Grand Sierra Resort, which is a glitzier and bigger casino. So that's happening next year. But we had a great time. And it was great to see a lot of the active duty aviators who come to Hook, particularly those who are doing exercises at the nearby Fallon Naval Air Station. So generally the air wing that is doing workup training there comes over for Friday afternoon, and the bug roach mixer, which is kind of the highlight of Hook. So that was great. Gave away a lot of T-shirts and koozies, and talked to both current guys doing it and a lot of well-wishers and fans. So that's great. And then we got back and went to the Oceana Air Show. This, not last weekend, but the weekend before. Fortunately, it wasn't last weekend because this tropical storm hit the East Coast and it would have canceled the air show. So we were able to get down to my old hood of NAS Oceana, where I served in 4 different fighter squadrons. And also my final fleet tour was in air wing operations for CAG-1 at Oceana. So I was boring people with, I was in that hangar and that hangar, and I did this here, and I got out of the airplane there. But it's, it's really your life and rolled out in front of you. And this is what's beautiful about a career in a job like naval aviation. As I think I've said on our previous conversations, Mike, the Navy was very good to me in that all I did pretty much was be in fighter squadrons, Tomcat squadrons. And then my final tour was teaching at the Naval Academy, my alma mater. But so when I go back to Oceana, and that's the first time I've been on the flight line since 2012,
Wow.
when I flew with the Blue Angels in number 4 on the practice day. So I hadn't been back since then. So what's that? That's 11 years. And before that, it had been, the last time I was there was 1998, when I got out of my final Tomcat hop in April of 98. Wow. So it's always cool to go back there. I am very grateful for the organizers of that air show to have invited me. And I think we were able to do good work. Some of the episodes that we did, both on the flight line and at the Officers Club, are live on my channel. So if you have not seen the conversation with Grouse, who's the Super Hornet demo pilot, the base CO is a guy who was one of literally the last Tomcat Rios. He was in the last Tomcat Top Gun class. And then he became a Super Hornet WISO, weapons system officer, as I'm sure your viewers know. And so I was asking him, okay, what's the difference? Because I've bantied this about with Admiral Carter and some other folks. Difference between the backseat of the F-14 and the Super Hornet, the F version of the Super Hornet, and the CO whose call sign is Wang, and I don't know what that comes from. His PAO would not let me ask him. So Wang goes into pretty cool detail about some of the objective and subjective parts of that difference. So I entreat viewers to check that one out. And then I talked to, and this is like a companion piece to my Air Boss interview that I did at Tailhook, Kenny Weitzel, who is now retired. He retired the week after that conversation. So I believe that interview is his last with any sort of media outlet.
Wow.
And people may know that I served with him as a instructor in VF 101 back in the mid-90s. So I've known him for a long time. Very proud of what he did in uniform. And he did a lot to sort of keep the momentum going that his predecessor had established in terms of flight hour funding and some other things like that. Plus, he was air boss when Top Gun Maverick came out, so he got to attend all the red carpet events and hang out with Tom Cruise and that sort of stuff. And he knew the script and the movie. You know, he had signed the NDI, so he knew it a long time before, or NDA, I'm sorry, before any of us did. And he, you know, I tried to ping him for that, and he wouldn't tell me anything. But so anyway, I talked to Air Lant at Oceana, and that episode I made live a couple of days ago. Admiral Verissimo, who was a Blue Angel in the late 90s and did this unusual pivot. So after he was a Blue Angel, and generally Blue Angels are very high demand aviators. So they generally go from being a Blue Angel to a fleet squadron. You know, who wouldn't want to have a Blue Angel in their ready room? Except his timing was such that the Navy was trying to get more tactical aviators aboard the ship to be shooters, to be catapult officers. And anybody who's seen any carrier documentaries will recognize the catapult officer is the guy in the yellow jersey who touches the flight deck and directs the catapult operator to fire the catapult so you go flying. And on Nimitz class and Ford class carriers, you know, you have the little bubble. You don't have to always be on the flight deck. In the early days, conventional carriers, there was no bubble. So the cat officers were always on the flight deck. They like to do flight deck shooting just for the optics of it, and in the event the bubble breaks or something. But so he did that. He does admit it wasn't his favorite idea when he was told this is what he was going to do, but he did he did the hard job well, let's say it that way. And the way he puts it is he had been a rock star as a Blue Angel. And so he needed this blue collar tour to be brought down back to earth and to be made to understand by working with the sailors who keep the catapults and the arresting gear. And, you know, that's hard work.
Absolutely.
And we love those guys and cherish them and take care of them. As a squadron guy, you'd always have them, you know, into the ready room and give them your stickers. You want your sticker, squadron sticker on their cranials. And we take great pride in sort of, you know, befriending them and engendering their loyalty to us over the other 8 squadrons in the air wing. So he did that, and then he went back and had a fantastic career trajectory, you know, flying Hornets, and he was a battle group commander or strike group commander. Another interesting note, Mike, is he took over as the strike group commander aboard Theodore Roosevelt right after all of that chaos associated with Captain Crozier getting fired because of COVID. Everybody might remember that. That was the spring of, what was that, 2021?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Right? It was wacky and a lot of chaos. Remember, the acting Secretary of the Navy was fired as a function of his performance when he went out to the ship and basically yelled at the crew, which you know, wasn't awesome. And so then Admiral Verissimo came aboard, because you will also remember there was some tension between Captain Crozier and the strike group commander, and that's kind of why he went around him and basically leaked his memo to the media instead of going to his direct boss and saying, hey, I'm not comfortable, we need to do the following. And so Admiral Verissimo went out there and just basically calmed everybody down and got them focused on the mission, which is very important. You know, every one of the aircraft carriers is a capital asset. So did that, and then went on to do some Pentagon jobs in the requirements and funding arena, and then was made to be Air Lant. So he's only been in the job, as we speak, 6 weeks as Air Lant. The other thing I will note that I was aide to Air Lant in the mid-90s. I was pulled out of the RAG as an instructor where I was with Kenny Weitzel because the guy in front of me was fired due to, let's just say, misconduct. I had met Admiral Less. I introduced him to bombing in the F-14. He came over and flew with us, and I was in his backseat to go through the switchology and the HUD stuff. Anybody who does DCS and has done dumb bombing in the Tomcat knows what I'm talking about in terms of the CCIP and the different modes and the HUD symbology. So I introduced Admiral Less to that. And then during the debrief, I mentioned that his son-in-law is an academy classmate of mine. And, oh, by the way, his son-in-law was also my detailer, the guy that gives orders. So with all of that information, that confluence of factoids, I got the nod to be his aide by his son-in-law, who was the guy who wrote my orders to go take that job.
Yeah.
So that's another one where up front I didn't want to do it. Who would want to leave the F-14 training squadron as an instructor where you're spending half the month in Key West, half the month in El Centro with all the different best and brightest? You know, that's a great job. Being a RAG instructor is a great job. So why would you want to leave that to go do what I viewed as horse holding, you know, as an aide? But like most things, if you have a good attitude and you work hard, you'll realize that this was a great opportunity. So basically the blinders came off. And Admiral S and I remain close, and that was a fantastic job. So
great stuff.
But at that time, Admiral S was a 3-star. This is before they did the air boss and the coast that was subordinate to him. So now Air Pac is 3-star, Air Land is 2 stars. Back in my day, they were both 3 stars. So I talked to Admiral Verissimo about that. So what's the differentiation of labor? How does he know what to do? The other wrinkle, and then we'll get to the questions here, is this holdup on nominations that is the political wrangling that's going on here in the States. Senator Tuberville has held up all the nominations. His boss, Admiral Verissimo's boss right now, is an old JO of mine, Admiral Wyckoff, who's not nommed to be Air Pac. He's not nommed to be the air boss. He's nommed to be Fifth Fleet. So he should be in the Middle East, in Bahrain. But he's just he's just sitting in place as the air boss for right now until this traffic jam clears up. So that's kind of weird, you know, and so we talk about those machinations and so forth. So bottom line, air show was awesome. My wife is on the mend, and we'll be going to Oceana again. And I want to investigate doing a real tour. So we're exploring other vehicle options. We were supposed to rent an RV. It was in an accident. So we wound up making the family 4Runner into our team vehicle. The same wrap that was supposed to go on the RV is now on my 4Runner. And it looks pretty good. So we're not going to take it off. My wife has agreed that we can leave it on. So as I drive around town, people are like, hey, I love the channel. So kind of like awesome. Free advertising wherever we go.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So busy times, but great times. And most of all, it was great to meet a bunch of fans of the channel and get to engage and hear what's on people's minds.
Awesome stuff. Yeah, I'm sure everyone is following your journey, as am I. But as you can see on the right there, Mooch, there's some questions coming in. So if you just start from the top, and guys, enjoy this.
All right. So Benjamin Perez, how did a lightning strike affect a largely analog bird like the Tomcat? Was there a boldface procedure for that? In NATOPS, lots of circuit breakers in that back seat. Okay, so Benjamin, the answer is there isn't a boldface associated with an electrical failure. There are steps in the pocket checklist associated with this sort of thing. So there are basically 2 basic flavors of electrical failures in all models of the Tomcat. So one is a generator failure. Either one or both generators would fail, and the corrective action in that case was, like most things, is turn it off and turn it back on. Is it still broken? Okay, now do some test lights, and that would tell you the nature of the problem. You really couldn't fix it if it didn't fix itself by turning it off and back on in flight. And then if you had a total electrical failure, and I've pulled up this PCL page, I saw your question before we went on air. So the first thing you do is descend or climb to get VFR. Now, I imagine you're asking this question because of this F-35B mishap that happened a couple of Sundays ago. And some of the rumor and innuendo, and I will caveat this to say we do not know this to be fact, but one of the things that people are bantying about is the airplane was hit by lightning, and then that caused a total electrical failure of the F-35. And if you watch the live stream that I did about the pilot's 911 call that was a little bit surreal. I did this live stream yesterday talking about the facts that came out of that 911 call, meaning he was at 2,000 feet. He verified that he had a wingman. He verified his age is 47, which is like up there. So what does that mean in terms of his profile? But the other thing I talk about in the what I call the infinitive is what happens if an F-35 gets hit by lightning, and what happens if an F-35 has a total electrical failure. So F-35 is a lot like, let's just call it a Tesla, right? So if you see the control panel, instrument panel of an F-35, it's just a piece of glass like an iPad. And remember, the helmet of an F-35 that costs about half $500,000, the visor is where your attitude information is. There's no HUD. So if I lose that and I lose this panel that goes black, I do have a backup system, but it's not awesome. Further, the weather at the time of this approach was terrible in the greater Charleston area. So he's in a thunderstorm, lightning flashing, no horizon reference outside of the cockpit. So that's a bad situation. So to your question, a Tomcat, being a steam gauge airplane, was more resilient. So let's say, and as I described in that live stream yesterday, I was hit by lightning 3 different times in the F-14. And you knew you'd been hit. It was sort of like this, glow would run across the canopy rail. And you'd feel, one time I felt actually a little bit of a shock. And then your next move after it's gone is, okay, do we still have everything? And every time I was hit by lightning, we did. We never lost anything. But if you do have a total electrical failure, as I said, your first move is get VFR if you can. And then you want to contact the air traffic control using your survival radio, because you're not going to have any radios now. And then you want to land as soon as possible, and you want to do an arrested landing when you trap or when you get on the ground, if possible. What NATOP says is the following systems are still available, and this is what's different. This is why, in this case, it's better to be in a Tomcat than an F-35 if you have a total electrical failure. You still have airspeed, the altimeter in the standby mode. You have the cabin pressure altimeter. You have your VSI, vertical speed. Hook works, standby, attitude, gyro works. You have emergency wing sweep. Gear will work, flaps and slats work. You have a standby compass and a backup oxygen system above 10,000 feet. So that's kind of what the NATO's procedure was. It was, get VFR if you can, land as soon as possible, do an arrested landing. And then it advises you what systems you have. So again, if you could choose what airplane you were going to be in with a total electrical failure, I'm going to suggest you'd want to be in a Tomcat over an F-35. Good question. All right, David Smith. What would you do to try and help a pilot who's having a tough night landing on the carrier? What would you not do? Wow, that's a good question. That's an awesome RIO question. So this is where the crew coordination or the TAC ORD came into play. Maverick and Goose, right? The premise is that you always fly together, and squadrons liked to do that. The tactical organization, you would be crewed with somebody. And generally you would fly together unless that guy was on duty, staff duty officer, or had a cold or something. You wanted to stick with that pairing. So as a RIO, your responsibility in the pattern, especially at night behind the boat, is to be a value add. So all pilots are not created equal in terms of what they need from a RIO, and you would figure this out. So during the brief, the pilots say, okay, I like to hear this on the ball, meaning, okay, I call the ball, and now he's flying meatball line up, angle of attack, trying to get aboard. So he will say, I like to hear XL, decel, and then reference on speed. So decel 2 knots slow, XL working a little fast, that kind of call. Maybe he would want to hear VSI. VSI is a little high. Okay, VSI is looking good, starting to sag a little bit. Watch the decel. So some guys like to hear sort of constant, almost like hypnosis kind of vibe, slow, steady conversation, like a yoga instructor, right? Other guys are like, don't say anything, I'm good. So I was completely agnostic. I didn't need to talk to the pilot on the ball. So that varied. Okay, now to your question, David, about a bad night. So now you're kind of therapist. And so your job was to calm the pilot down. So if you've ever flown DCS, some running jokes about Jester, what Jester says when you bolter. And sometimes he says good things and sometimes he's obnoxious. So you don't want to be obnoxious on a bad night. So this is where you're leveraging what you know about the personality of your pilot. Is this a guy who reacts to humor? Is this a guy that needs tough love? If this is a guy who needs, verbal shoulder rubs, it varied. But you would definitely have to be a value add at that point and not something that's going to make it worse, because you could make it worse by going, saying something as you bolter or as he gets waved off in close, like, come on, doggone, I'm hungry, those kinds of things. That's not helping. And as a RIO, you signed up to be along for the ride in these phases of flight. And so you really have to commit to, okay, my controls control the radar, not the airplane. So what can I do to help this guy get aboard? And some of that was science, like make sure he hits his numbers. And so let's say, again, you bolter or get waved off at night. So you go upwind, they turn you downwind. It's not as tight a pattern as the case one pattern. So as you're getting back to comfortable on downwind and waiting for them to hook you in at 2 or 3 miles, you're like, okay, I think we were working a little fast there. Let's really focus on airspeed this time. That kind of thing. So you're mini LSO as well. So it's a number of things, but you definitely want to make sure that you're helping and not hurting. And there's a big difference between those two things. Great question. Hope my wife is feeling better. She is, David. Thank you. Yeah, she's on the mend. So, right, Sublet says, will you be in Pensacola in November for the Blue Angel Homecoming show? If so, I hope to meet you. So I hope so, right? Hoser and I, who were in comms just today about how that might come together. I have to see how my wife keeps on the mend, but I'd love to. So more to follow on that, if not this year, for sure next year. Hakan Engman says, were there any F-14 backseaters that didn't want to be pilots? I think we were all sort of, frustrated pilots. It's just like when you play intramurals in college, you're probably a frustrated high school varsity athlete, right? So I think generally the only thing that made RIOs in my day was we didn't have 20/20 vision. And I think that was a good thing because we all enjoyed the aero part of being a RIO. We weren't just a weapon systems operator. We were also co-pilots. That's what I enjoyed, both in the dogfighting arena. I used to love when the pilot didn't have a tally directing him and just filling his HUD with bandit. Great sense of pride of doing that. And that required great trust from the pilot to actually pull to the G limit of the airplane based on what I'm telling him when he doesn't see who he's fighting. And then also getting a pilot aboard through the co-pilot piece, calming him down, giving him a sugar call that really did save the pass and get us aboard, those kinds of things. So that's all about being a pilot wannabe at some level. And this is why I enjoy flying DCS, because I get to actually be the pilot of the Tomcat. And that's also why I enjoyed being a RAG instructor, because a lot of your RAG instructor duties where you are the co-pilot. And the guy in the front seat doesn't know as much about the front seat as you do as a career RIO. So I took great pride in all of that. So I think in general, Hakan, I think all of us wanted to be pilots, and that's what made those good RIOs. Hobby time. Hi, Ward. Love your channel. Been a subscriber for a while. Great to see you here. It's great to be here. I love Mike's channel, and it's an honor to be back for a second appearance. Again, to Hakan. Did you, as a flying staff, consider yourself to be part of the surface Navy? No. We were part of the air wing. I mean, obviously, we knew where our bread was buttered. We respected those who drove the ships. We respected the crews of, like, the cruiser that had the air warfare mission in the strike group. A lot of my classmates are surface warfare officers. Members of the staff on the carrier, the admiral staff, were surface warfare officers, but aviators definitely considered ourselves as part of the air wing and not part of the surface Navy. Should the F-14, Hakan again, should the F-14 have been upgraded or kept, or was the F-18 a full worthy replacement at the time of replacement? So I've done a number of episodes about this. The short answer is yes, the F-14 should have been kept on. I think history bears that out. No, the F-18 was not a suitable replacement for the mission that the F-14 did. The basic fact is the F-14 and the F-18 have about the same fuel flow rate, except the F-18 starts with 6,000 less pounds of gas. So already that outer air battle mission that the Tomcat performed, that fleet air defense mission, cannot be done by the Hornet. And the Super Hornet is a improvement. That airplane's 33% bigger than the Legacy Hornet, but it still isn't a Tomcat in terms of endurance and the ability to take it to an enemy at long range. So I did that episode that, here's why we shouldn't have canceled the F-14 and what it would have been if we had the Super Tomcat. That's not the exact title, but something to that effect. And I go in great detail about what was happening on the Hill and at the Pentagon at the time that the F-14 was canceled. And the Hornet was, the choice was made to go all in on Hornet, right? And then Super Hornet. So this is a multi-factor situation. Budget, world events, is the air war a viable thing post 9/11? Taliban doesn't have an air force. The Iraqi Air Force was basically grounded because of Operation Southern Watch. And just now, as we emerge out of the post 9/11 conflicts, are we thinking about what we're calling a return to the peer fight? And so this is where we're like, it would be great if we could, like, take it to them like 1,000 miles away from the carrier. You mean like we used to with the F-14? And so now we're like, okay, 6th gen NGAD, that airplane has to be able to, have more endurance and go farther away and have a long stick capability and be able to, get to the Chinese before they can deliver a hypersonic weapon that'll take out a Ford-class carrier, for instance. So this starts to sound a lot like the logic that created the Tomcat in the first place. Soviet era bombers that had AS-4s that could reach out and touch an aircraft carrier from long range. So Tomcats with Phoenix missile could take them out before they could deliver that AS-4. So this is all a long answer to say the F-18 is a capable, flexible airplane. Their radar system in many ways is superior to the AWG-9. And if you watch that episode I did with Wang, he describes how much easier it was to come out of the notch, for instance, in a Super Hornet than a Tomcat. However, the airplane is inherently limited by its gas. Further, we don't have that many two-seat versions of the Super Hornet. And the Super Hornet doesn't really need a second seat because you have MFDs and all kinds of things where you can bring up the same information in both cockpits. So, the world has adapted to the equipment we have, meaning carrier aviation has adapted, shorter cycles. We bring the air battle to 500 miles instead of 1,000 miles. We punt on organic tanking and having mission tankers aboard the air wing and depend on Air Force heavy tankers now. Jointness is more of a thing now than it was. Well, it was a thing at the end of my career, but in the middle of my career, we didn't really, play with the Air Force. It was all about the carrier battle group at that time. So it is what it is. But obviously, as a Tomcat guy, where I sat is where I stand. And I sat in the backseat of an F-14. And I'm bullish on what that airplane was and could have been had we brought it along in terms of where technology went. Imagine a glass stealth F-14. That would have been a kick-ass airplane. Great question. Gray Wolf. Hey, Ward, voice of Jester AI here. Yeah, I know. I love your work, okay? I love your work. I do hoot on you, but it's awesome. What you did there was fantastic. Just want to say thank you for all the work you do on your channel. I enjoy it very much with the depth of interviews you do. Coming from you, that means a lot, Gray Wolf. Thanks a lot. My man Doug Sherman's here. First responder to the stars, one of my patrons. Actually, he was my first patron ever. Good to see you, Doug. Let me see what else we got here. John Minter. Did you ever get to fly any of the CAG special paint scheme Tomcats? If so, did you have a favorite? So, we didn't have like a full up cool rainbow CAG bird in any of the squadrons I was in. What we would do, because in that era, we were all about low vis jets, right? So you would have, if you look at like VF-102, if you Google VF-102 and look at the images, some of them are the low vis paint scheme, and then the one that Mike used as the thumbnail for this Q&A, that's a high vis version. So the CAG bird, the Modex would be, in our case, it was either 100 or 200. But the X00 bird in every squadron would be your CAG bird, and that would be a high gloss version. Now, in some cases, and this was encouraged, by maybe a celebration of a particular anniversary of naval aviation, they'd go all out and make a really cool paint job. I never was in a squadron that had that level of effort, but I really do like those. Freckle Puny says, hi there. Hello. 67 Tomcat. Ward, have a copy of Combat Aircraft Magazine from 06, and you have one of the greatest quotes of the Tomcat ever. Do you remember the occasion for the quote? Was it in a book? So please remind me what that quote was. Put that in the chat. Do you think the Pentagon, Neuropilot says, do you think the Pentagon Navy should make it easier for staff aviators to stay current enough not to get grounded? It's a cool question. So this is always the balance in the course of a career. Back in the day, and you could get away with it in my day, you wanted to stay in the cockpit, and that would at least get you to squadron command. But now you have to have a joint tour, you have to have an advanced education. You probably won't make flag if you're not smart about how the Pentagon works, so you need somewhere along the way to serve in the Pentagon. And that usually doesn't start until you're a lieutenant commander or above. And then you'll be like a executive assistant or special guy or an aide or something. You have to endure that pain. So the trick is to do those jobs, because those are non-flying billets, right? And so the trick is to do those jobs just enough so you don't lose your proficiency completely. And this is why you have refresher courses at each one of the rags. So, Cat 2, Cat 3, Cat 4. So you come back as a department head, COXO, CAG. You need less and less training time because you're just basically knocking the rust off. I think the Navy does a good job of maintaining proficiency in that way. And we're always cognizant, the Bureau is very cognizant about, okay, how much time have we kept this guy out of the cockpit? And he needs to get back, right? Because this is a safety of flight and a warfighting consideration. So I think in general, we do that well. Freckle Puny says, ever lose your breakfast, lunch, dinner during hard maneuvers in F-14? I'm proud to say I've never thrown up in an airplane. And it's just not something that affected me. I know a lot of guys that it did affect, especially during our early days of flight school. That's how P3 guys were made. Everybody would be like, I want to be a RIO. And then they'd do the squirrel cage in the T2 and they'd get sick and they'd be like, I hate that. I don't want to pull G's. And they decided they wanted to be ASW guys and fly the P3. Although the P3 flew in some regimes where the airplane was getting jostled around a lot too. So what I respect is somebody who got sick and kept doing the mission and learned to get over it, and so in time you realize that, okay, I can fight feeling nauseous, and I know it's a unusual feeling, but you get used to it and you stop throwing up. But for my part, I just never did. And even my first flight, when I was a midshipman in the backseat of a Marine Corps F-4 out at Kaneohe in Hawaii, I didn't feel airsick. So I think I'm lucky in that way, because I can imagine that'd be hard to perform if you're feeling sick, if you're throwing up and then you have a headache, and that would be the worst. But I've never had that problem. Dieter Schmidt, was there also a manual wing sweep mode? Yes. You could lift up the handle. In fact, you can see this in Top Gun Maverick. He lifts up the handle and moves it forward during that egress where they're fighting the felons on the way out of the country. The only thing that's fakey about that is you can't go forward of where the computer says you want it to go, right? Because that could damage the structure of the airplane. But yes, you can manually move the wings by lifting. I should be using this hand, lifting the handle and moving it. That's how you'd sweep the wings aft to come into the break. That's farther back than the computer says they should be, but the airplane slows down faster with the wings in fully swept at 67 degrees. David, again, any thoughts on Commander Leo Enright? I've heard the official version in tape, unofficial version from a few pilots. Who's curious about your thoughts as a RIO. So I knew Leo very well. When I was the RIO training officer in VF-32, Leo was the operations officer, great mentor of mine, very smart on the back seat. He had been a VX4, before there was VX9, there was VX4 guy. And so he came armed with all kinds of savvy about the AUG-9. You're talking specifically about the Gulf of Sidra incident. And for anything beyond what I've just said, I invite you to either watch or rewatch that episode, because I go in some detail about that performance. But in general, Leo's a good guy. Hakan asks, how will the F-35Bs be supported in regards to operational reach? Extremely small internal fuel tanks. Yeah, that's a real issue, and so again, we've taken the radius, the strike radius, the power projection radius, and reduced it. So we're not going to be doing F-14 height of the Cold War numbers with respect to the outer air battle. I think what the F-35 designers, and you mentioned the B, so the B is even more gas limited than the C because of that fan system that allows it to land vertically. So that's not their mission. The outer air battle is not the B's mission. Their mission in the most general sense is to support Marines during the initial assault and close air support operating from amphibs. That's where the Marines are different than the Navy. But if you talk about the Lightning carrier concept and some of that stuff where they could be used for power projection, again, they're not going to do 4-digit numbers. They're going to do mid to medium 3-digit numbers in terms of the range. So that's a concern. That's a consideration. You're going to need heavy tankers. So there's going to have to be some sort of Air Force footprint in that area of operations as well. Dieter asks, could you outmaneuver a Skyhawk? So we used Skyhawks as aggressors back in the heyday when VF-43 and the other aggressor squadrons were very active. And as I mentioned, that I bored air show attendees at Oceana by pointing out the hangars that I was stationed, hangar 500, hangar 404, hangar 200. I also would say, and then in between the Tomcats and the intruders was the aggressor squadrons, VFC-12 and VF-43. And they had a whole bunch of A4s. So a lot of this was who was flying the A4. The other thing that made the A4 lethal was some of them had the P408 engine. They called it the Super Swine. In fact, one of their TA4s that I got to fly a bunch had that P408. And that's the same engine that's in the Prowler, by the way. The Prowlers are very powerful. You have two P408s. That's a fast airplane in mill power. In fact, the Tomcat, the A version of the Tomcat, could not keep up with a Prowler at mill power. We'd have to go in and out of burner. So you give a P408 to a very skilled aggressor pilot, he makes you lose sight after the merge. Now you may wind up getting shot by a Skyhawk. Now, if it's 1v1, especially if I'm flying or my guy's flying a B or a D, on paper, the Tomcat's going to win every time. But again, this is why we care about pilot skill, and this is where it was determined was in the warning area, actually doing it. And I've seen some guys maneuver the Skyhawk. Snort Snodgrass, the late great Snort Snodgrass, was a legend in being able to make the Skyhawk, the A4, do things kind of like the Felon. He could make it pirouette, and he could make it just stand on end, and he just swap ends at the merge, all kinds of stuff. So that was a cool fighter that was supposed to be like a MiG-17 sort of performance, MiG-19 performance in terms of the bleeder and subsonic airplane. So those were good days. That was when the air battle, the air-to-air war, dogfighting really was a focus item. It's sort of less so now based on the threat. Shabi asks if F-14 was upgraded like the F-15, can F-14 still fly in this era of the Super Hornet? I mean, design of F-14 can survive modern day air warfare. So the assumption there, Shabi, is it kept up in terms of materials, right? So we're not going to be making this gen Super Hornet out of aluminum. It'll be the same composite materials that we make F-35 Super Hornets out of. So in that way, the radar cross-section, low observables, it's, I'm sure if you look at that episode and some of the other articles that have been written about the Super Tomcat, the idea of a Super Tomcat, what Grumman was pitching in terms of this is what we can do with this platform in the out years, it has kind of some bumps and curves, and it's conformal, and the idea was we'll make it near stealth, if not full up stealth. So, and also in terms of maintainability, the problem with the F-14 is it had a whole bunch of, as you saw in my original walk around the F-14 on the Naval Academy grounds episode, where I bang on the panel there, and one of the Calfax is actually loose on that panel. Our technicians had to take these speed handles and undo every one of those fittings one at a time, manually. Okay, that's suboptimum in terms of on-the-fly maintenance between the trap and the next event cat shot. So let's imagine that we modified the F-14 in follow-on designs to be as maintainable as a Super Hornet, meaning panels are easy to access, these weapons replaceable assemblies, it's plug and play, and then you take it down on the test bench. You're not doing wiring and all kinds of stuff on the flight deck. You're just slamming a black box in place that's good to go because you checked it on a test bench, and you have all the digital gear and maintainable stuff that makes that so. So I imagine if the F-14 was still around, we'd have all of those things. So therefore, I'm suggesting, Shabi, that it would be survivable and lethal in this 5th gen era. Mike L. asks, I have heard other naval aviators, Hornet guys, say that some point-on approach to the carrier, you would get spatial disorientation, but you had to trust the LSO and keep it coming. That's true, right? So in some weather situations, and if you watch the episode I did with Hoser, remember Hoser was the CAG LSO when I was a Super JO in VF-143 aboard Eisenhower. And we would fly and be in the goo. You couldn't see the ship. And you get to the ball call, still can't see the ship. So the pilot is flying needles, and I had a repeat of his needles in my display so I could see how he's tracking in terms of left, right, up, down. So we'd say, let's say 200 Tomcat ball Clara, meaning we don't see a ball. Okay, I'm sorry, I wouldn't have said Tomcat ball. 200 Tomcat Clara ball, meaning I don't see the ball. And in that case, the LSO may have saying, you sound good, keep it coming. It's a crazy call, isn't it? You sound good, keep it coming. And so good LSOs by sound could tell if you were on glide slope. and they had this 1 potato, 2 potato. Now, if you get to be like at half a mile and they still don't see you, they wave you off. So you had to trust the LSOs. The other thing, to your point, you know, the spatial disorientation, vertigo, if you've ever had it. I remember one time I got it really bad. We were flying form because our airplane was Nordo. So we're flying form on another Tomcat. Both airplanes are dirty, flaps and slats down. And so he sort of stepped up a little bit. And we're looking at him. And so that visual gave me the idea that we were in a slight right-hand turn. And so when he kissed us off and flew away, I came back in and I looked at our instruments. My gyro just came uncaged and I had this massive vertigo. So, you know, Benjamin asked that question at first, how do you be a value add? Or who was it asked that question about? David asked that question about, you know, how do you help the pilot and not hinder? So one thing you would never say is, man, I got vertigo. How about you? Right? A RIO would never say that because that could induce vertigo. It's like, I didn't, but now I do. Thank you. So you just suck it up and trust your instruments, right? So I know many pilots have said to me, I felt like we were inverted when we landed, you know, so their inner ear is totally gooned up and they're just flying their instruments and looking at the meatball lineup angle of attack and ignoring their sensory perception. Imagine how hard that is to do and how scary that is, especially at night. So good question. Yeah, trust the LSO, trust your gauges. What's the fastest I've been in the Tomcat? Mach 1.8 is the fastest I've been in a B version of the Tomcat. Again, Freckle Puny says, I've read from some of the F-111B was not as bad as it was made out to be. In which areas do you think the F-111B was as good and perhaps superior to the F-14? In terms of the precision attack, circa 85, 86. You know, the other thing about the F-111B, it had the TF-30, right? The same engine that the A version of the Tomcat had, except the TF-30 was actually made to fit in the F-111. So that airplane was very fast on the deck in mill, not to mention when it tapped burner. So, you know, that was a cool airplane, side-by-side seating, good crew coordination. You know, the pilot could sneak a peek at the WISO's controls and the navigator's controls and so forth and so on. As you saw with that El Dorado Canyon episode that I did, that wasn't their finest hour, and I think that was a poorly planned mission. It wasn't so much about the airplane's capabilities, but when they were prepared and had the advantage, that was a very lethal platform. So I'm a fan. Captain Crunk, hello, Mooch. Have you thought of doing a collab with Mike Starbaby Petruccia? Be neat to hear you compare experiences as a RIO versus a WISO and their capabilities. So I've done that Pepsi challenge with Paco Benitez. He's my Air Force guy. I don't know Starbaby, but I'm not opposed to doing that sort of thing with a guy like him. But I just don't. Generally, what I do is the guys I know and am in contact with. So I think I've done some of what you're talking about, but there's always more to do. So perhaps I'll do that in the future. My good friend Harry Lime asks if you could. Hold on, I just scrolled away. Hold on. Here we go. If you could go back in your career, is there anything you would change or go farther and make a higher rank? So I think the one thing I wish I'd been able to do was have squadron command. So it just, you know, super competitive. You know, there were certain orders I had in certain phases of my life where maybe the CO and I didn't see eye to eye, and maybe I thought that he cared about my opinion. I mean, you guys know me, right? And so imagine me as a lieutenant or Lieutenant JG. So that's just the way it goes. I have no issue with what I was able to do in the Navy. As I said, the Navy was very good to me. I got to be in 4 fighter squadrons and the ops officer flying with the same squadron that I was a department head for as CAG Ops. So that's a cool life, you know. That's why I love being able to have this channel where I get to celebrate, recount, revisit some of the highs and lows of that life. As I was just saying to Admiral Verissimo, who was talking about one of the things that's keeping him up at night is recruiting. You know, I don't know if it's because everybody thinks the military's woke or, you know, people are criticizing General Milley or whatever. I don't know. But what I know is there's nothing like being in a squadron, regardless of what kind of airplane you fly. And for me, there's nothing like being in a fighter squadron aboard an aircraft carrier. So the rest is timing, chemistry, just like in the corporate world. You know, do you get along with the CEO? Were you in the right place at the right time? Did you raise your hand and say that cool idea at the right time at the staff meeting? There's a lot of happenstances, a lot of different things. So I think the one thing, Harry, that I would say is I wish I'd been able to command a fighter squadron. But other than that, I wouldn't do anything different. The other thing I will say that if I'd stayed in the Navy any longer, Punk's War wouldn't have been published. I wouldn't have been editor of military.com. And that's a pretty straight line from then to me having this YouTube channel. And so I love what I'm able to do with this platform. It's such a gift at 64 years old to be able to have this kind of impact and to share it with guys like you. So, you know, as you get to be my age and you look back, I'm going to say don't have any regrets. And I don't really. And I know that there's this sort of symbiosis that happens, this organic thing, the way things unfold. And I'm happy with how things have worked out. But good question. Nostalgia Freak, was the Phoenix capable of shooting down other air superiority fighters, for instance, the F-15? Sure. I think F-15 guys were smart enough to know when to dive into the notch to make the long-range version of the Phoenix go stupid. That time of flight was pretty long to take out a fighter, and certainly the bandits got smarter and smarter as time went on. In fact, if you're a DCS flyer and you do like a 4v4 against MiG-21s or MiG-23s or MiG-29s, you will see as soon as you launch a Phoenix, they dive into the notch. That's great design by Wags and the other folks, the Heapler guys, and that's realistic. So, but if an F-15 doesn't know he's targeted and he just trolls, you know, at 30,000 feet, and I've fired a 75-mile Phoenix, he's going to die. You know, so yeah, you can shoot down a F-15 with a Phoenix. Freckle Puny, I'm sorry. Could you have ever envisioned being an A6 Bombardier Navigator rather than an F-14 RIO? I'm glad I got RIO when that selection process came up. I know a lot of BNs. My ex-brother-in-law was a BN. In fact, we did our first deployment together. Bruce Dillard, whose son was the director of Devotion. If you see that episode where I'm at the red carpet, the East Coast red carpet event for Devotion, talk to Bruce. After many years, BNs had an important job to play. You know, watch Flight of the Intruder, the movie, or read the book by my good friend Stephen Coons. But I loved the fighter arena, air to air. I loved being in a pointy nose jet. The A6 wasn't really a pointy nose jet. It wasn't a supersonic jet. So I had a choice. BN was one of them. I chose RIO, and I'm glad I did. But BNs worked their asses off, and without a BN, the A6 was not really a very lethal platform. Ray asks, question, when does the RIO switch from heads down to heads up, or is it constantly fluid? Thanks that the better half is on the mend. Yeah, thank you, Ray, for those well wishes. So I think in general, it's when you went from the radar picture to the visual picture. So let me just say that number would be 10 miles. So up to 10 miles, I'm working, you know, the AUG-9. So probably in trackwell scan, auto or manual, working with the other RIOs in the formation, section, division, 2-plane, 4-plane, sorting, targeting, monitoring weapons in the air. When you get to about 15 miles, you dive into the notch, right? Because you anticipate a forward quarter threat from the bandits you're going against. And then coming out of the notch, I'm still inside. So now I'm trying to get my pilot a diamond and sort with the other guys in the flight so that everybody is locked on different bandits coming out of the merge, not the same bandit. You know, you don't want to throw a whole bunch of missiles into an airplane that already exploded. So that was a lot of work, and that's definitely heads down. But at about 10 miles, if you know, or if I already got him a lock and he's going after that dot in his diamond, then I'm out of the cockpit. You know, I'm gonna look over at our wingman and see who he's merged with. Make sure that some guy doesn't fly down our wing line that the pilot doesn't see, or some guy's not turning on us that none of us have seen. So now I'm in co-pilot mode. You know, and if he sees that one, I'm looking somewhere else. Two guys looking at the same bandit is not. That's a waste of assets, right? That's a waste of resources. So that's my answer. Is 10 miles is kind of when you went out of the cockpit in a BVR to visual arena scenario. Doug gives us the rock on emoji because he's a rock and roller. John, great to hear your wife is recovering. What was life like in a Tomcat squadron in the 80s? Scariest moment in a Tomcat? So life was good, right? Especially, here, let me get a sip of drink here. Life was good, especially, you know, summer of 86. Top Gun came out. The O Club was mobbed. You know, the Tomcat was in the public consciousness, you know, and it was cool to be a Tomcat guy. So plus, even beyond pop culture, the mission was preeminent. The mission was number one because the Soviet threat was real. The Soviet air threat, both fighter and bomber threat, was real and kind of prominent. So we had 11 fighter squadrons and a RAG on each coast. So 11 on the flight line at Oceana, 11 on the flight line at Miramar, which was the Naval Air Station at that time. Top Gun was all about, okay, what do we need to do with the Tomcat? It was the focus of Top Gun, and Top Gun was at Miramar at that time, not, you know, it moved to Fallon later, where it is now. So those were great days. Scariest moment in the Tomcat was always behind the ship at night. So, you know, rough seas and the Mediterranean, the Western Mediterranean in the wintertime, around Sardinia, you know, south of France, could get very rough. In fact, my second cruise, we lost 10 aviators, peacetime cruise. We lost a Tomcat, two A6s, and an S3. And so just the act of landing airplanes on the ship in and of itself, even absent hostilities, is dangerous. That's what Punk's War is about, really. You know, they're not really at war at that in that book. That's pre 9/11. And the idea behind it was like, I'm going to show the reader that just getting on and off the ship, conducting cyclic ops is action-packed and challenging in and of itself, right? So the scariest moments were generally bad night at the boat. Almost had a midair with an F-15, an Air Force F-15 over Morocco during a exercise called African Eagle. So much that we felt the thump and heard the burner being lit in the Eagle. My pilot kind of pressed the shot a little too much on that one, as the F-15 was basically in falling leaf mode. Pilot didn't recognize it, and he had to throw the stick forward, and we bunted to keep from having a midair. So that was scary. The other one is one I've documented a few times, especially when I'm talking to Hoser, because he was on the platform working MOVLess, the manual ball, because the automatic lens won't keep up if in rough seas. So he's working the ball to get the airplane where he wants it as the LSO. So Northern Atlantic, Beaufort, 11, 25-foot seas, green water over the bow, just trying to get aboard in the daytime. We didn't fly at night, wisely. Was the hairiest flying I've ever done. And particular flight with a guy named Grinch Brophy, boltered 4 times. He caused one bolter because he saw the screws of the ship come out of the water of the Eisenhower, and that freaked him out, and he just went to mill power. And we did a long bolter. But that is scary. So notice everything I'm talking about in terms of scary is the act of landing Air Force guy will never tell you, yeah, the scariest thing I had was I was landing, at the field. So landing at the ship, this is what naval aviators take pride in, um, especially pilots, and we take pride in supporting them, is tough. It's less dangerous now because of PLM and the other things that aviators have these days, but it still has its dangers, as evidenced by the ramp strike on Vincent a couple of years ago. It's still not naval aviator proof, and you still got to have your act together. It's a good question, though, John. India John got a daft question. Big fan of the daft question. And Paulie, I'll get to you in a second. So, Indiana, John says, did you have to tell the carrier about your ordnance when you were landing for the arrested wire's weight? I'm aware you had to say what your fuel state was, but what about weapons? So that's a great question. So the airplane would always weigh. The only variable there was fuel state, right? So max trap. Let's just use the B for instance, right? So max trap was 54,000 pounds. Okay, so that means that's how heavy the airplane is with gas. So let's just do some math here. Let's say the base weight of the airplane is 44,000 pounds, and I have four sidewinders and two sparrows, right? So that's 2,000 pounds of ordnance, right? So that's 46,000 pounds. So now the max amount of gas I can have at the ball call is 8,000 pounds, right? So if I go Tomcat ball 8.0, they know that, okay, this airplane is no heavier than 54,000 pounds, and they can do the math from there, right? And so I don't want to say it didn't matter what your ordnance was. You just couldn't be above max trap with the ordnance, if that makes sense. You didn't have to specifically say, I have these weapons aboard still, or whatever. You just called your weight, and they'd figure it out. Set them up Tomcat, and they'd say what the weight was, right? And that's why the ball call matters in terms of what type of airplane it is. And this is why they were really stressing over what should we call a Super Hornet, right? They settled on Rhino. But they have to know, okay, this isn't a Hornet, this is a Super Hornet. And this is why the Growler and the Super Hornet weigh different things coming aboard, et cetera. You got to know it. And if you get it wrong, you can part the wire, right? Because you don't have enough tension baked into the hydraulics to stop the airplane, and it'll tube lock, and then that's how you have a mishap. Let me know if that answer makes sense to you. So Paulie Baseman asks, glove veins, tell us about them. When they're removed, seems a bit of the Tomcat urban legend. Let me grab our training aid. Hold on here for a second. All right, training aids like we like to have on the channel. So this is our trusty model that I've used in a number of episodes, including the first episode to go big, which is the Goose's Death episode. But here are the glove veins. All right, so the idea of the glove veins was when the airplane was bombing, that would provide stability in the bomb mode. Further, there was some idea that at supersonic airspeeds, it would also provide an additional control surface to keep the airplane stable. Well, it turns out it was just a maintenance nightmare and actually didn't do anything that they thought it did. So in the B and the D, they took the glove veins off, right? So they are cool, right? So we used to come into the break in what we called Darth Vader mode, which is you go to bomb, which causes the glove veins to program out, and then you manually program the wings after 68, and you have the glove veins out too. It's kind of a cool look. But they were, let's just say, unnecessary in terms of aeromechanic performance. Yeah, and it is an urban legend. The existence of them is an urban legend. But, it's like your wisdom teeth. You can pull them out, and it doesn't matter. Did you have to tell the carrier about your, oh, hold on, we already did that one, sorry. Okay, so 67 67 Tomcat. I don't have the copy of it in front of me, but the quote was something about being with the hottest girl in high school and the plane stayed. I guess I probably said something ridiculous like that. I'm quoted in a few of those books. Most of the ones that are written by Heijo. F. George, hello. Do RIOs get surprised by the G? Well, if the pilot doesn't give us a heads up, you can be surprised. If you suddenly just snap on a turn, you can, and especially if you're like down here looking at something or whatever, and it just throws on the G. Yeah, you can be surprised. But this was sort of a crew coordination issue. You don't want to hurt anybody. Just like we were talking about in this Thunder over Michigan ejection, where it seemed that there was a lack of crew coordination between the backseater and the front seater, and he just ejected for whatever reason. We'll find out. But same drill. You don't want to put on a bunch of G when somebody's not ready. But RIOs pride themselves on always being ready. Especially if you're in a dogfight situation or a dynamic situation, you knew the G could come at any time, and you'd adjust. Hakan, is there a bit of distance and camaraderie between the Navy aviators and the Marine Corps aviators, or is it one team in every type of way? So let me just talk about Marine squadrons attached to Navy air wings. So on 3 of my deployments, there was a Marine squadron. One time it was the Prowler Squadron. Well, I take it back. One time it was the A6 Squadron. One time it was the Prowler Squadron with a Marine Corps Hornet Squadron. There were actually 2 Marine Corps squadrons in the air wing on America. And then the last time it was a Hornet Squadron, VMFA 251, the T-bolts. So having Marines in the air wing is awesome. They are very professional. They are very weapons focused. They know what to do. In those days, they could be a little scary behind the boat, particularly the A6 guys who hadn't seen the boat since flight school. So that could have been kind of sporty. They got it, and they were on the step before he knew it. So there's a healthy, Marine Corps Navy tension, in anything. The Marines fancy themselves as more military and better, and they, as we say, my dad's a Marine, remember, and my son and my brother. So they polish the trophy. They'll tell you about Chapultepec and Tripoli and all of those things, but they back it up with performance. So I think whatever there was in terms of, there wasn't distance. There was one team, one fight, but there was a sort of healthy rivalry going on at any given time between the Navy and the Marine Corps. Mike asks, would the 2-seat Super Hornet have been better for the Marines? Well, remember, they have a 2-seat Hornet, right? The D model that does the FAC-A mission and supporting boots on the ground. So would the 2-seat Super Hornet have been a great replacement for the D? I think the answer is yes. The Marines' budgets are finite. The Marines had to make choices, and they wanted the F-35B. They're sunsetting the D and the Hornet in lieu of Bs. They need the V-22. There's things, they want the 4-bladed Huey and Cobra. They've made choices. The budget isn't infinite, so they were never going to get the Super Hornet, unfortunately. But I think you make a good point that as the D was a cool FAC-A platform, so too would have the F been a great FAC-A platform, which is what the Navy's using it for. Remember, the Navy has a CNO-approved FAC-A syllabus, and you're a FAC-A qual as a WISO. Crews, actually, pilots and WISOs are FAC-A designated, and they do a lot of FAC-A work. They did a lot of FAC-A work during the post-9/11 wars. We did a lot of FAC-A work in Bosnia. They did a lot of FAC-A work in Kosovo. So that's a mission that any 2-seat platform does well. And, you want to give that mission to 2 guys. A-10s do it by themselves, but sometimes you get task saturated, 9 lines and everything else without somebody that can look down and take notes and, update the nav system and all the other sorts of things, especially back in legacy aircraft where we didn't have the sort of, check your heads up display for your 9 line. You can do that now. You can just inject digital information in a way that we couldn't back in our day. You actually had to be voice comms, Stand by for words is what the FAC would say. That meant 9 line to follow. Boom, boom, boom. And you'd have your knee board and you'd look at the grid and you'd smoke in the air and all the other stuff. Super busy mission. And we would always comment, I don't know how you do this by yourself. Pilots would say that, right? Thank God I got a RIO. So the Super Hornet would have been a great Marine Corps FAC-A airplane. Exactly.
Hey Ward, I'm just going to jump in there because we're starting to break up a bit. I don't know if it's on my end or your end in terms of internet connection here, but do you want to answer one last question to wrap up this brilliant Q&A?
Okay. I look good on my end. I don't know what we're doing. How do I look now?
Yeah, it's just a bit it seems a bit choppy, so it's just I don't know what's happening. I don't know. It could be on my end. We've had some work recently around here, so maybe one more question to wrap up, Ward.
Oh, okay. Hakan, let's do this UFO question. Far out question. Why do you think the Navy has been an actor in the last few years UFO UAP debate and congressional hearings, while the U.S. Air Force has been quite invisible? Well, I think it's because the Navy, for whatever reason, and if you watch the episode that I do with Sunshine, I think the reason is because they have seen UAPs in warning areas that are used by the Navy, which are mostly over water. I don't know if that's on purpose because there's a test point that's being, flown or whatever. We'll find out. But that's my only explanation, is because Navy guys and girls have been involved because they're the ones who've seen these UAPs, either the Tic Tac or the orbs inside the cubes and that sort of thing. So I think if you were to ask me, the answer for why has to do with the test program, and they're being conducted over water, and so that's where the Navy will be operating for their exercises. So that's my answer. All right.
Right. I mean, thank you very much, Ward. That was an absolutely brilliant Q&A, and hopefully you guys enjoyed that. But yeah, Ward, just to wrap up, where can we find you online? Obviously, you got your YouTube channel, but if you can remind us, your website and your social media channels, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I have an Instagram page called YouTuber Ward Carroll, and I'm on X under Ward Carroll, at Ward Carroll. And so those are nice supplements. If you like my channel, those are nice supplements. I use a lot. I use X a lot. I use Instagram less. And that's about it. I have a website, but I don't really use it. Our website's a thing anymore. So I think X and Insta are where to find me. But mostly, as you've said, Mike, I'm on YouTube. That's my main jam.
Brilliant stuff. It's all linked below in the description, guys, so go and check him out and give him a follow. But thank you very much for everyone who's come in the comments and put a great question toward. But Mooch, thank you very much again for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure, as always.
Always a pleasure, Mike. Anytime you want me to come aboard, I'll be glad to do it. And thanks to everybody for the great questions. A really good session.
Great stuff. Cheers, guys.